And so just this shift from moving from, can I make it happen? I'm not hopeful about that. And if people feel they're not hopeful, they tend to kind of think, what's the point of thinking about that? That's a block. And so what we're
Yeah.
saying with active hope is that we need a different way of thinking about influence, where we don't have this evaluation process. Am I hopeful? And if I am hopeful, then it's worth me spending time. But if I'm not hopeful, what's the point? That's a block. It's a psychological block. And we can change that block just by thinking differently about our power to make a difference. Where we start with, okay, and the 3 steps are: start from where you are, facing what you face, feeling what you feel. And if you're doing that, then you're already doing step 1 of active hope. So if you feel miserable about what's going on in the world, thank goodness you've noticed. Thank goodness you
Uh-huh.
care.
Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Forum. I'm so glad you're here, and I'm so excited about today's topic because I know it's something that will support the lives of each one of us, everyone who's listening. And that topic is active hope. And my guest is Chris Johnstone, and he's a co-author with Joanna May of the book Active Hope: How to Face the Mess We're In with Unexpected Resilience and Creative Power. And this book is widely known. It's been published in 18 languages. And Chris is also a medical doctor, and he's worked many years in the mental health field teaching resilience skills. And I know that's something that we could all use as well. And I'm not going to go any more into Chris's bio. I'm going to let him tell his story. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Carol. What a real pleasure to be with you.
I'm so glad you're here. And tell me, I know you're in the UK. Where are you in the UK?
I live in the north of Scotland. We're as far north as southern Alaska and also southern Norway. So it's on the chillier side of Europe, but it's a fantastic, beautiful place. We're just 4 miles from the sea. There's seals nearby, dolphins also in the Murray Firth, the area of water near us. So yeah, I'm really pleased to be here.
Oh, that sounds delightful. It's so wonderful to be surrounded by the animals and nature. So, yeah, as you probably know, and everybody else who listens to this podcast, I'd love to start off with you telling us your spiritual story and how you got to this place of teaching active hope and practicing it, and just kind of what was your whole trajectory of getting to where you are today.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Carol. I mean, there's many different parts of the story, but I think one of the main things was, as a young adult, a student in my late teens and early 20s, I was deeply concerned by what I saw happening in the world. And there were a number of things. One is that in the early 1980s, it was a time of superpower tension, the threat of nuclear war. I used to have scary nightmares about us all being blown to pieces. And so that was part of the backdrop that I entered my adulthood into. But also, I did a part of my school, I did training education, I did environmental studies, and I was lucky to do that. And I was totally fascinated by nature. I used to kind of spend my childhood kind of looking into ponds and studying pond life. And I also saw that there was a rolling back of nature even then, that rock pools in a local shore close to us were basically killed by the building of a big marina, that all the silt from that killed the life in the rock pools, that in the ponds, a lot were basically dried up and used for agricultural land, and poisoning of
Mm.
pesticides in rivers. I remember seeing a picture of just this river just covered in dead fish. And I just had this horrible feeling of like, what are we doing to our world? So this was me kind of emerging into adulthood in the early 1980s and just thinking, um, I was studying medicine. And as part of my studies, I actually spent some time in Sri Lanka, an amazing part of my training where you could go and be involved in something related to medicine there. And I spent some time with a Sri Lankan development organization that was really, they called it a kind of psychosocial spiritual approach, that they were looking at the process of awakening inspired by many different religions, not linked to any one particular, but not just in individuals, but also at the level of villages. Like, what would it be like to have a village awakening? What would it be like to have a
Mhm.
society awakening? And that, in particular, they aimed for what they call a no poverty, no affluent society. That if we can have a society based on what is it we really need? How do we find richness that's not just material richness, that's also social richness, psychological richness, spiritual richness? And I was really inspired by that. And at the same time, both inspired and horrified, because in that time, I also encountered human starvation for the first time. That I spent some of my time at a centre for abandoned, malnourished children, and I remember picking up this 2-year-old child with matchstick thin arms and legs that had been found abandoned in a state of severe malnutrition. And this is happening to tens of thousands of children die every day because they don't have their basic needs for life, basic needs of clean water and essential calories. And I just kind of had this horror of, how come I live in part of the world where there's such relative plenty, yet this also happens. And so that kind of switched me on to something. And my life since then has been studying medicine, wanting to have well-being on a personal basis, but also feeling this sense of quest really to how do I find and play my part in a bigger picture. And an important step on that journey was also meeting and working with Joanna May, who's been my most important teacher, friend, guide, also co-author of Active Hope. She trained and background as a teacher of world religions. She had worked very closely with Tibetan Buddhist refugees in northern India. This was back in the 60s and 70s, must have been like years ago, that and she became very interested in Tibetan Buddhism and taught world religions at different universities in the States. But she also she did a PhD looking at Buddhism and systems thinking. So systems thinking is a whole body of thinking out of science, really. And she kind
Mhm.
of really kind of was fascinated by how in Buddhist thinking and systems thinking, they were kind of saying the same thing, which is really about a deep understanding of our interrelationship, our interdependence, our what Thich Nhat Hanh calls interbeing, that we are
Mhm.
part of something larger. And I just felt so at home with what she was saying that I began working with her very closely. This is the late 1980s by then. And so I've had that as a ongoing thread of my life, what she would see very much as engaged spirituality. It's a spirituality of seeing ourselves as very much part of the world and in service to the world, but also belonging to the world, feeling ourselves as part of our world.
I love the term engaged spirituality. I think that's what's missing in a lot of people's quote spirituality. People get very focused on their own stuff, and it's so important to do our own healing. And so that's like on one side, and on the other side, it's important to be engaged in the world and active. Your story is so interesting. I think that one of the things that I picked up from it is you bore witness to a lot. I think one of the things that happens for people, we can get in our tiny little bubble, especially in the United States. We're really not always seeing things like the destruction of the pools that you were talking about, or the starvation of a child. It's very much conceptual with so many people. So it's so easy to be in our own little materialistic bubble. But in your life, you were in situations where you actually bore witness to the destruction that's happening, and that deeply impacted you. And I would love to, I think a lot of people, we're going to probably go into the three stories that you talk about. A lot of people are kind of business as usual because they haven't borne witness. They don't see what's really happening. So you're a person to me that sees, that's awakened, that's changed your perspective, and then you're in action to try to bring others into this awakening process through, I think, active hope is what we're talking about. So I think it's wonderful that your path has brought you here and that you're doing such great work in the world. So let's talk about active hope, because I think that so many of us either we're walking around like nothing's wrong, or we're stuck in the mud because there's so much wrong. And I think active hope is something that kind of brings us all into creating a future. Am I right about that?
Very much so. And it's interesting because bearing witness, I think another area of important bearing witness, and I really like the way that you've shone a spotlight on that as part of my journey. And I think of it as a transformative dip. A transformative dip is where you have a kind of a dip into something that shocks or horrifies you, but in a way that kind of wakes you up to something that acts as a
Yeah.
wake up call. And in the resilience research, this is very clearly documented. They talk about post-traumatic growth or adversity activated development, that how if we're just in the comfort zone, it may feel better, but we don't learn to face things in a way that gives us confidence, in a way that supports us to engage in the adventure of life, that we can end up in retreat from anything that's too scary or overwhelming. And I'd say the place that I learnt about active hope, or one of the places, was bearing witness in my work in mental health and addictions recovery. And I worked as part of a specialist addictions treatment team for years and years, about 17 years, with people with severe alcohol dependence. And I know that this is a big problem everywhere
Mhm.
in the States as well, that probably you speak to most people and they don't have to go very far in their own lives, either in their own experience or people close to them, friends or family members, before they start encountering somebody who's struggled with some kind of addiction or substance use
Mhm.
problem. It's so common. And it's interesting about active hope because a lot of the people I worked with, they completely given up hope for understandable reasons, that they try to stop drinking and they might succeed for a while, but then they failed again. They tried to stop drinking, they succeeded for a while, and then they failed again. And I remember one client saying to me, he said, "Chris, I've given up giving up because
Mm.
every time I try, I only last so long, and then I have that horrible, painful crash again. And it's just kind of heart, life destroying, to keep crashing, keep failing. And you kind of think, what's the point?" But it's interesting that feeling, what's the point? A lot of people feel that about the world. They feel like world problems, you can't change the world. If only that were true. If only it were true that we couldn't change the world, we wouldn't have this problem of the climate crisis and the decline of nature. It's because we can change the world, but we're doing it the wrong way, that we're in the mess that we're in. Anyway, that's another thing. But the common feeling of like, well, we can't make any difference. What's the point of even trying? That leads to a state of hopelessness. And there was a big study done of young people, 10,000 young people in a whole range of different countries around the world, and over half agreed with the statement, humanity is doomed. And if there's
Mhm.
that backdrop of people feeling like, what's the point? We're on a downhill slope, we can't do much about it, then that has a huge impact on people's investment in life, investment in acting for a better future. And what I saw in addictions recovery was I saw people reach a point where they'd felt that, but then something shifted. And it was a different kind of hope, not so much hopefulness. Are you hopeful? Many of them would say not very or not at all. But what do you hope for? It's when they really got clear that they hoped for recovery so much that they would go as far and as firmly to support their recovery as they used to do to support their addiction. That there's a kind of deep inner shift where it's not just a matter of, oh, I'll try a little. It's like it became the most important thing in their life. That what can I do today to support my recovery? And I just wonder, what if we really got the crisis we're in, and we approached recovery with as much determination as what I saw inspiring determination I saw in many of my clients. It was like a really deep level, kind of the life force, the deep desire to continue living for life. I want to survive. I don't want to be extinguished or become extinct. That kind of sense of I want to continue, but also there's a deep understanding that the way to do that is also through supporting others. That I love this phrase, solidarity is self-interest. And that's
Mhm.
why, for example, in 12-step addictions recovery groups, the 12th step is about supporting others. There's a lovely saying in recovery groups. They say the way to hang on to it is to give it away. The way to hang on to your own recovery is to give it away in supporting others. So if we had this sense of deep understanding that if we want to recover, if we want to have well-being in our own lives, that we can't just have a all about me approach, that's been part of the problem. It's taken us to where we are. And this ties in with what I learned from Joanna May and what I learned from the Sarvodaya movement that I was with in Sri Lanka, is this deep understanding of our interdependence, that we are part of something larger. And so then active hope, it starts from opening your eyes and mind and heart and accepting the reality that you face. It's not kind of
Mhm.
wishful thinking based on a distorted view of reality of everything being fine. It's like it's having that rude wake up call of ouch, there's some things horribly wrong in our world, maybe horribly wrong in our lives. But it's also okay, that's the starting point. But recognizing that wherever you are, whatever you face, however you feel, it can go different ways. I put my hand up like this because each finger or thumb represents a different way things can go. And so active hope starts from where you are. That's like the palm of the hand. And then recognizing it can go different ways. And there's a choice of, well, what do I hope for? And if you know what you hope for, then the third step is to be active in heading that way or making that hope more likely. And that's what I saw in the clients I worked with. It's not about hopefulness. It's about what do I deeply hope for and how can I act right now to head that way. And if we have that approach to our world, it's like, do you hope there will be a world for children living today that will there be a world that's safe for their grandchildren? Do you now, how many people say, "Oh, no, I'm not interested in that," you know? But if you hope for that, what would it be like to really put yourself behind that hope? That a world that's safe for the children of today, for their grandchildren, and then we think, "Well, what about their grandchildren's grandchildren? Or their grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren?" Because at the moment, we are on a course very clearly heading for a world that's becoming more scary, more depressing, more unsafe, more dangerous. And we can change that. We can't necessarily just click our fingers and it all be solved. But I think in the book, The Active Hope that you refer to, and I love this subtitle, How to Face the Mess We're In with Unexpected Resilience and Creative Power, we talk about 3 stories. Is it okay to move on to that? Or did you want to say anything first?
I do want to say something first. I just want to make sure I have this clear because I think what you're saying is we get stuck in the hopelessness. And one way to step out of that is first to define what do we hope for. Is that what you're saying? Because I think that that's the action we need to take first. Maybe that was the second or third, I'm not sure, but the idea it's we get so stuck in the muck that I don't know that many people are actually articulating, "What do I hope for?" Is that what you're
Exactly.
saying?
I think one of the things is that there's this, kind of block that happens of, I hope for something, but then the question comes up, can I make that happen? And if I can't
Right.
make it happen, what's the point of hoping for that? And
Yes.
and I think this is where there's a different way of thinking about our power to make a difference. And one of the things I say is, well, if you can't make something happen, can you help it happen? And there's a real
Yes.
difference. So, for example, where you are, you're in North America and I'm in the north of Scotland. I can't make it happen that you switch on a light or switch on a light or switch off a light. But I could help it happen by asking you nicely. I could say, Carol, would you mind switching on the light or turning off the light? So I have influence, but I don't have control. I can't make it happen. I can't force or control you to do anything. You're outside my circle of control. And some people say just focus on your circle of control. And if it's outside that, then just don't worry about it. But actually, we live in a world that's interconnected where everything we do has ripples of influence that extend beyond us. And so just this shift from moving from can I make it happen? I'm not hopeful about that. And if people feel they're not hopeful, they tend to kind of think, what's the point of thinking about that? That's a block. And so what we're
Yeah.
saying with active hope is that we need a different way of thinking about influence where we don't have this evaluation process. Am I hopeful? And if I am hopeful, then it's worth me spending time. But if I'm not hopeful, what's the point? That's a block. It's a psychological block. And we can change that block just by thinking differently about our power to make a difference. Where we start with, okay, and the 3 steps are start from where you are, facing what you face, feeling what you feel. And if you're doing that, then you're already doing step 1 of active hope. So if you feel miserable about what's going on in the world, thank goodness you've noticed. Thank goodness you
Uh-huh.
care. That's a positive thing that you've noticed, a positive thing that you care. It's much better that people feel anxiety and alarm about the danger that we're heading into rather than feel, oh, I'm fine, actually. I don't worry about that stuff because it's outside my circle of control. I can't do anything about it. That's the kind of thinking that just takes us over the edge of a cliff. Whereas if we say, okay, I am disturbed, I am alarmed, I have noticed, I do care, that's part 1. But then part 2 is, okay, of the many different ways it can go, what do I hope for? And then the 3rd step is to be active in support of your hope. And when you do that, you add meaningfulness to your life. You give your life a direction. And it can start to make sense in a world that feels horribly frightening and falling apart sometimes.
Yeah, so that third one, I can see another block because I agree it's important to see what's wrong and feel the agony of that, and then to discern what do I hope for. And then I think what happens also is it can look like I'm just one person and there's 8 billion people in the world. How can I possibly make a difference? I think that seems like another block. I've heard that from a lot of people. Even if I take this step, what does it matter? There are so many billions who are not. And so why take it at all?
Yes. And if that were true, that what we did didn't make any difference, we wouldn't have the climate crisis. That there's a thinking here, and I find very helpful the statement, big happens through small. Big happens through small. Whenever you think of anything big, whether it's like a big story, a big process of change, it's always made up of lots and lots of smaller elements that act together to contribute to that. And you might think,
Mhm.
in your own life, you might think of significant things that you've done that you look back on with a sense of satisfaction. And you might be able to identify that there are really tiny steps. It might be that, just one day I had a conversation with somebody. And after that conversation, I felt differently to how I did before. And that's just an example of big happens through small. It's through these tiny steps, but it might be, okay, well, I made a decision, but I followed up my decision with some actions. And they were small actions at first, but one thing led to another. And there's something here, systems thinking. Systems thinking is a way of understanding reality, where we're looking at how smaller parts act together as larger wholes, or we might call it, a system is a whole that's more than the sum of many smaller parts. And in my training in medicine, I found the systems approach was a complete breakthrough. It's really the basis of a holistic approach to healthcare, rather than just
Hmm.
understanding people by looking at under a microscope, which I used to do a lot when I was a medical student. And, there was this idea in medicine of reductionism, that basically the way to understand something complex is to break it down to its pieces. And if you understand about the molecules and the cells, then you understand about people, but you miss out on so much. And so what systems thinking does is it sees our world in layers. So as well as the cells, as well as the molecules, as well as the organs, there's whole people. Anyway, so systems thinking leads to a different way of thinking about power. And this is so important because the research shows that when you ask people how they feel about problems in the world, the commonest response, according to a Mental Health Foundation survey years ago, was powerlessness. So many people feel that, exactly as you say. And so what we need is to train ourselves in understanding how small things can play a part in larger processes. And that's why I love this idea, big happens through small. That if you look
Yes.
at your individual actions, I really take my hat off to the work you do, Carol, that you have conversations with people because you know that conversations have powerful ripples that extend beyond just the two people speaking. And so you've set up this podcast, you have inspiring conversations. I've watched some of them and felt some of the ripples extending out. And you might think, oh, that's a small thing. That's not going to do much. But as well as the circle of visible influence, what you see and what you know, there's also the circle of invisible influence. So the circle of invisible influence is the unseen ripples that you never know what might
Yes. Yeah.
happen as a result of something you do.
And also time. I think we also think if I act now, something needs to happen right after that. But the impact of what I do now, I mean, we have no idea. Maybe separated by a long time, a short time, we don't know. And the impact may be huge after we've passed, just like we've seen many artists and musicians and their music being so, wonderfully appreciated now, and they've been gone for hundreds of years. So that's another thing we think that it needs to happen. Whatever I do, I need to see the fruits of it right away.
Yes.
That's probably like another block. Yeah.
And the
And
key.
you mentioned, go
Oh,
ahead.
no, no, over to you.
I was just going to say, you mentioned the climate crisis, and I don't want to minimize that, but I think a lot of people who are listening to the podcast have all sorts of crises on their minds. Some people are really concerned about the corruption of government, famine, exploitation of humans and animals. There's so many things that different people are looking at as, this is something that I am so concerned about. But what you're saying is that's good news. If we can identify what is our thing that we're really upset about, that's directing us towards where we can be in action in the world. I think sometimes though it looks like, for example, like the corruption of government, it's like, well, what can I do about that? It's such a mess over there. But anyway, let's work on active hope on some of these kinds of topics so that we can make a shift in our consciousness.
I love the idea of a story of active hope. And a
Yeah.
story of active hope is something that can happen through you, can happen through me, can happen through us. And in any story, there's a very important point where there's a call to adventure. A call to adventure is where you feel stirred, called, pulled, tugged to go somewhere or do something. And right early on in the story, you don't know how you're going to do it, but you just feel a sense of, I want to do something about this. This really fires me up. This really bothers me. And so the key with active hope is direction. How do I move in this direction? And I think one of the most important things you can do is turn up with an intention to play your part. If you turn up with an intention to play your part, say, how can I be part of a story of active hope here? This really bothers me, whatever it is. So this is my call to adventure. And I've experienced some of the different calls to adventure I've mentioned, whether it's the rock pools all dying or holding an abandoned, malnourished child, being horrified by the threat of war, seeing what's happening with the weather weirdness that's happening all over the world that many people are experiencing, and the alarm of where the trajectory of that is, whatever it is that stirs us. I love the idea that activism is being active for a cause that's bigger than you are. And when you're active for a cause that's bigger than you are, it situates your life in a larger story than just me, how do I get on? Me is very important, but me needs to be in a larger context. And the context I love, there's a term called the beautiful life. The beautiful life is one that's good for me and other people and the world. And if we have that as our core basis in life, how do I live a beautiful life, one that's good for me, other people, and our world? Where I'm showing up in a story of active hope, where there's something I deeply hope for. You know, I have deep hopes for myself. I have deep hopes for the people close to me. And I also have deep hopes for the larger communities or world that I'm part of, that I belong to, that I identify with. And I want to play my part in heading in a more hopeful direction from where we seem to be headed right now.
That's beautiful. I love that. So then what we do then is we begin to engage in the world, engage, like you talked about, engage spirituality. So the next step would be to find a way to be in action. So I'm actively being the hope that I have.
I love the idea that hopes can happen through us. It
Yeah,
can happen through us, through our choices, through our actions. And the starting point is just through our awareness of what's going on. So, okay, if there's whatever the situation is, if there's something which at the moment is heading in a not very hopeful direction, just to be alerted to the issue. Okay, have I noticed? Do I care? You know, if you've noticed and you care, that's a great starting point, because from that, you can get your call to adventure. Your call to
I love that.
adventure of, okay, I feel stirred up by this. I want to play my part. And if at the beginning of the story you haven't a clue how you're going to address this, don't be put off, because in a story, there's lots of chapters and you don't have to sort everything out all on page one. It's like saying, okay, I've got to the stage where I've noticed, I got to the stage where I care, and I'm also getting to the stage where I'm making a deep seated decision in myself to show up and play my part in this story. So I want to live in a story of active hope. And I know I want to, but I don't know how. And there's a lovely phase. This is something I learned from addictions recovery work, because sometimes people know that they want to stop drinking or drug use, but they haven't a clue how they're going to do it, because every time they've tried so far, it's just been a horrible, miserable failure. But there's a term called the preparation stage of change. The preparation stage of change is, I know I want to, but I don't know how, or I'm not quite ready. And so the preparation stage is, how do I get ready? How do I get ready for, I know I want to do something about whatever it is in the world that alarms me, whatever it is in my life or my family that alarms me. You know, that in terms of stories of change, they happen on many different levels, and it's not either
Hmm.
me or the world. It's beautiful life of, I want to take part in a story that's better for me, better for the people I care about close to me, people around me, and also better for the larger community, society, world that we're part of.
I love the term call to adventure because it takes it out of this realm of, oh, this is work. This is hard. I can't do it. It's a call to adventure. That's exciting.
Yes, and the great thing about adventures is that they contain an expanse of time. You know, it's not just an adventure of like 5 seconds. An adventure is something that has a journey with ups and downs. It's a bit of a roller coaster. And so by calling something an adventure, you're recognizing that it's not all going to be sweet and comfortable, that it's going to have moments of real scariness and adversity, but also it's not going to be only that. that one of the things adventures have is they also have turning points where it starts looking like this, but then something shifts and it becomes like that. And if you recognize that sequence of turning points, and I often ask people in workshops, I say, have you ever been in a situation where you're facing something really hard and you just thought, this is never going to change? I'm never going to be able to. But then some while later, you find that it does change and you can, that you find a way through. And if you've had that experience of yourself thinking it's never going to change, it's never going to happen, then that's a vital reference point for when you look at the world and you might think, oh, it's never going to change. So that's one source
Mm.
of reference point. You can also look at historical reference points. You know, there was a time when women getting the vote seemed pretty unlikely. Nelson Mandela in prison in South Africa, the idea that he'd become president of South Africa must have seemed extremely unlikely. There was a time where the transatlantic slave trade was just seen as part of business as usual. You know, how
Mhm, mhm.
horrifying. It's this absolutely awful, awful thing that was just seen as, oh, well, that's the way things are. We can't do anything about that. If people had thought like that then, our world would be so different. It's because people had a sense of, I deeply hope that things will be different. And they put their lives on the line. They put their lives in support of their hopes. And we've seen amazing things happen. There's still huge problems. There's still such a distance to go. But it's important to recognize also the distance that we've come because people weren't put off because they didn't feel hopeful.
I think that's so important to remember. I read a whole biography about, is it William Wilberforce? Is he's the one who finally, I think he spent 15 years trying to introduce into the whatever the, I'm sorry, I don't remember what the
The British
UK,
Parliament.
the Parliament, yes.
Mm,
I was going to say Congress, but he introduced that legislation for 50 every year for 15 years. And it's like, who does that?
yes,
Bring it up again, bring
yes.
it up again, bring it up again. And just that awakening process was really interesting. I read that book. I wrote a really long blog about it once because I remember thinking this is the same way that people feel about the exploitation of animals or there's slavery going on in the world today too in huge numbers. So this sense of it's not going to change. It has changed in the past and dramatically. And we need to remember that. And it was because people like William Wilberforce took on the adventure. And I think this adventure thing, it's so interesting to me. I've been thinking about, okay, so what if we related to each other by saying, hey, how's your adventure going? Or how's your adventure today? Or where are you on your adventure? And we
Yes,
engage in that way.
yes. What calls you? What
Yeah.
what part do you want to play in this larger story? And
Yeah.
quite often people say, well, I haven't a clue. But then this is where active hope comes is, do you hope that you'll get a clue? You know, would you like to have a clue? And if you hope for a clue, then you can be active in seeking one out. You can make it more likely that you find one. And if you hope to be able to make a difference, you can be active in training yourself, teaching yourself. And this is why I love the term active hope training, where we recognize that facing what we face, you know, whatever the issues are that call you, it can feel like too big. You kind of think, well, what can I do? But if you say, well, do you hope that you'll be able to do something? And then how can you train yourself? I'm very inspired by the lengths that Olympic athletes go to because it's very important to them to do well in the Olympics. You know, their choices about when to go to bed at night, what to eat, how they train. They don't start out being in the position of being able to do their top performance, but they train themselves because they know that there's a process of when you give your time and attention to developing a capacity, it can increase. And I sometimes say to people, if you had a choice, you could be in the team of running very quickly for your country or acting for life on earth in this time of great crisis, you know, and which team would you prefer to be on? And if you prefer to be on the team of life in this time of decline of nature, it's a catastrophe what's happening. We live in a time of mass extinction of species where
Mhm.
there's a kind of rolling back of nature and we're paying a price for it. A rolling back of agricultural land that's available with loss of topsoil. There's all these problems kind of in that might seem kind of beyond what we give our daily attention to, but they have a huge impact on us. Even it's just like the quality of the air that we breathe. That if these issues are important to you, would you like to train yourself so that you could play your part in a more effective way? That if at the moment you feel I can't, would you like to move to a place where you feel, oh, maybe I can? And this is what we lay out in the book, Active Hope, is that we lay out a strengthening, transformative process that helps people find and play their part in addressing the issues that concern them. And we don't tell people what issues there are that they should be concerned about. We mention some along the way as examples, but it's much more about what bothers you enough that
Ah,
you'd like to train yourself to make a difference in that area, that you'd like to strengthen your ability to live with active hope, for hope to happen through you, through your choices, through your actions.
that's beautiful. I think active hope, to me, it's like a spiritual practice. And you write in, I think I got this out of your book, active hope, like Tai Chi or gardening, is something we do rather than have. It involves acting in support of our deepest hopes for our collective future. It's something that we practice. Like you said, the Olympic swimmer, the Olympic runner, the concert pianist, they are practicing. And so hope is something, active hope is something that we practice daily and that we can get better at it.
And it also improves our well-being. There's
Yes.
something here, and I think of it, yoga is a practice for well-being. Tai Chi is a practice for well-being. Active hope is a practice for personal and collective well-being. It improves our own well-being. Very good research shows that when we live with a sense of meaningfulness in our life, that we feel our life is contributing to something that we have our heart in, that it has all kinds of well-being benefits, that we tend to feel better, we're lower risk of suicide, actually tend to live longer. There's a very good research around this. Feel better. So there's benefits for us. This is the beautiful life where it's not either or selfishness or altruism. It's more like to have a beautiful life. I want a life that's good for me and also for other people and our world. And one of the key questions is, what's mine to do? What's my bit? We each have a piece of the puzzle or pieces of the puzzle. And so it's like, where do I feel called? What are the things that I can do? And if I'm not clear, do I hope to become clearer? And so there's practices that I think of them as inner compass practices. So a compass kind of is a tool we use to help us find direction. But we have a kind of inner compass that kind of points the right way. And this is where spiritual practices are very important. Just the whole sense of listening for guidance. Can we listen for a sense of what feels the calling for me? And it links to the call to adventure.
This whole call to adventure is the hero's journey.
Yes, it's our sense of what's a calling for me in this time that
Yeah.
is a richer, deeper, more enlivening version of being alive, rather than just going through the motions of doing what I'm expected to, of climbing the ladders and chasing the kind of successes that other people see as important. It's actually saying there's a different story about what our life is about. And
Yeah.
this idea of story, there's the business as usual story, which is the idea that we can carry on our business the way we usually do. And it's very clear, the evidence that if we carry on living the kind of standard way industrialized countries, we'd need about 3 to 5 planets like Earth to provide all the resources and to cope with the waste. It's basically it's unsustainable. Unsustainable means heading for a crash, can't be sustained.
Mhm.
And that, okay, so business as usual is taking us to this crisis point. And another story that many people see, and the evidence is there, is that our world is literally falling apart. You can call this story the great unraveling. It's not just a little bit of going wrong here or there, but actually there's some really deep fundamental things going wrong. And you've mentioned some of them. We might see different aspects of it, but there's a sense of something is deeply wrong here. And that's why we start with the subtitle of our book, Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In. We'll see the mess differently, but we're just acknowledging, wow, there's such a mess we're in. But then also it's like, okay, the story is about, okay, how do I respond to that in a way that supports my hope, that heads in a direction that's meaningful for me?
And that is the third story, is the great turning.
Exactly that. And I say the great turning, this term great turning, one of the ways that it kind of came about was particularly in an article looking at what might future generations refer to our time as. Will they talk
Yeah.
about it as the time where everything fell apart, the great unraveling? It was David Corton. He wrote this article in Yes magazine, and so that could be one version of the future. And another version of the future, they could say, "Wow, this is the time where we really got the wake up call. We really acknowledged that we were steaming towards a disaster and we wanted to change it." So it became the time of the great turning, where we kind of got it and we had this historic turning process, a bit like we might now look back on the abolition of the slave trade or the women's suffrage movement, or so many big changes in history that didn't happen all at once. That we might look back on this time, future beings might look back on this time as the great turning. And when I talk to people about that, I often hear people say, that's a lovely story, but I can't see it happening. And this is where
Ah.
active hope comes in, because I say, well, if you can't see it happening, do you hope it will? And if you hope it will happen, how can you be active in heading that way or making it more likely? And there's three turnings here. The first is turning up. Turning up with an intention to play your part. If you do that, you're part of this story, the great turning. And turning up with an intention to play your part, there's a turning away from the things that you know are wrong, the things that you know are contributing to the problem. And we're all probably find, things that we do. I'm certainly aware of it myself. There's some things I do or involved in. I think I need to turn away from that. I need to do
Mhm.
that less. And there's things I want to turn towards. What's the ways of being and organizing ourselves that heads in the direction that we hope for? And that is the great turning. It's the inspiring story of our time. And it's a story of active hope that we can take part in every day through doing this simple practice of active hope. Start from where we are, identify what we hope for, take active steps to move that way to make our hopes more likely.
I just love this. I think this great turning is something that it's so inspiring to be able to say, I'm going to participate in the great turning versus, I participated in the great unraveling and made sure it happened.
We can
Which story do you want to be on?
Exactly that.
Uh,
Which story do you want to be on? And we can be in business as usual. I find there's moments in my life I
yeah.
think, I'm very much in business as usual here. And then there's also the great unraveling. And just to be aware that the unraveling is happening is actually a step on from the business as usual, because you can be unwittingly contributing to the destruction of our world. And so just
Mhm.
to be aware of the unraveling is like, okay, at least I'm aware. And if I feel upset about it, it's a sign that I care. And then it's like saying, okay, how do I turn up with an intention to play my part? That's the good story of the great turning. And I can do that every day by saying, hey, what can I turn away from? What can I turn towards? And
Yeah.
if you feel stuck, then say, okay, when you're learning anything, when you're in any great team and you're training, you're going to come across blocks, you're going to come across setbacks. And particularly in an adventure, it's just part of the way these adventures go. But what helps is seeking out good company and training yourself. Finding some other people who share concerns and say, hey, how can we help each other train so that we can more effectively play our part? And that's part of the shift when we move from thinking, I can't do anything, what's the point, to I'm so concerned about this, I'm going to show up. I'm going to play my part. Even if I don't know what it is just now, I'm going to start the process of looking, training. And that's what we've set out in the book. We have a free video-based online course that talks people through the same kind of journey as we have in the book. It's at activehope.training. And we rely on donations to keep the whole thing going. But it's on a what they call pay it forward model. So pay it forward is like every place on the course is a gift from other people who've donated. It's a free
Oh,
present
nice.
for you. And
Yeah.
if you find the course useful, then we invite you to give a gift that will, you're not so much paying back the person who paid for your place, but you're paying forward so that there's free places for people in the future.
Oh, that's lovely. I'll make sure all those links are in the show notes. As you were talking about people helping along the way, what I started thinking about was the hero's journey. And if I recall correctly, the hero's journey, when you decide to take on the adventure, one of the first things that happens is your guides show up. People who are going to support you on your journey. The hero's journey, it really is a journey in consciousness, I think, overall. And you end up going into the cave at the bottom of the journey. So you're talking about the journey is full of ups and downs. But one of the first things that shows up on the hero's journey is your guides. And so I think that's probably what happens with this act of hope too. You kind of step into this abyss of I don't know how I'm going to really participate in the great turning, but because I have this intention, I would guess that the universe would then kind of fill that space and provide you with the guides and the other kinds of people that you'll be in community with as you continue on your journey. Has that been your experience?
Yes, I think it's both hands that there is, as
Yeah.
well as the guides, there's also the threshold guardians. And the
Yes,
threshold
yes,
guardians are the kind of the blocks in the way, here's me, I want to
yes.
get there, but there's a kind of guardian, something standing in the way. And you have those in all great stories. And so if you feel blocks, you could say, okay, I bumped into a threshold guardian, one of those blocking forces. And so that tells me I need to seek out a guide. And sometimes the guides just pop up, and sometimes they pop up, but we don't see them, or we're so busy watching telly or doing something else, that we kind of don't give them our attention. But if we're actively seeking guidance, if we have that openness, if we have that sense of, I need help right now, and I'm going to play an active role in looking for that, we're more likely to see the guidance that's there for us.
Yeah, and I'm sure your free course, your books, all of that is definitely guidance for people.
And your podcast,
And my podcast, yeah.
that's part of what you're doing here, is that you're
Yeah.
inviting in people. You say, hey, have you got any useful guidance that might be helpful for people listening? And also
Yes.
your own experience too, your deep commitment to show up and play your part. You're wanting to share what you've learnt, but also seek out people you see expressing that and say, hey, come on my show. I like what you're saying. I'm finding it useful. Tell me about it, and other people can hear too.
Well, thank you for that acknowledgement, Chris. It is. This podcast is a voice of hope, inspiration, and awakening. And I do want to amplify the voices in the world that are inspiring people and providing hope and helping us awaken from the slumber that we've been in and awaken towards this beautiful world that we're co-creating.
I'm with you. I'm with you in this purpose. And I think that's the thing. I love the idea that Active Hope taps on people's shoulders and says, can I happen through you? And there
Ah,
might be
I love
like
that.
some projects where it might tap several different people, and you find yourself bumping into someone else who they've had a similar inspiration to you. And it's not like, is it your idea or their idea? It's like the idea has chosen both of you, has chosen you and say, hey, can I happen through you? And when we find that sense of shared purpose, shared calling, it leads to a really richer sense of community. And I think that's the challenge of us, is how do we, in spite of our many divisions, we might call ourselves this, and if I'm one of these, I'm anti one of those, is how do we recognize that beneath any separation, there's a deeper unity? And that the deep calling in our times is, how do we make it through this scary, difficult time we face in a way that we plant seeds and help the possibilities of a better future that we deeply hope for?
That's just so beautiful. I think that's a wonderful closing note, but if you have anything else you wanna close with, I'd like to give you some time if there's anything else that you didn't get a chance to say.
Well, the great thing is we have a handout for this podcast, which is the book Fictive Hope. So that's what I point people to. Joanna and I, we spent such a lot of time having these conversations. Joanna in California and me in the UK, and I love the idea of 1 + 1 = 2 and a bit. So when you find fruitful collaboration, you create something that wasn't there before. And so if you ever feel it's just me, what can I do? Look for partnerships and collaborations where you might bring something else into being. And if you can't find somebody just now, just think, okay, that's part of my call, is to find ways of seeking out company. And the company doesn't always have to be human. It might also be a landscape that when I spend time there, I feel somehow rooted and connected. Or there might be certain beings out there you think, I want to act for them. I'm in alliance with them. I want to be their advocate. We can become friends of our world and work with our world for the future of life.
Well, I'm inspired, and I just know that everyone who's listening, I'm knowing for them that they're inspired. And I think the idea that we're being tapped on the shoulder and by hope, saying, "Can I come through you as me?" I love that. "Can I come through you?" So I just invite everybody who's listening to listen for that tap on the shoulder, to feel that. And when we're stuck in the muck, I think also the fact that that's a good sign. We're stuck in the muck. We see something we don't like. That's just the beginning of our adventure. There's so many amazing, wise nuggets of wisdom in this podcast. And Chris, thank you so much for joining me and sharing your your joy, your wisdom.
Thank you, Carol. It's a real pleasure. Thanks for inviting me in.
We'll make sure that we have links to your books and all of the things that you're doing on the podcast notes. So thank you everyone for joining us. And I now close the Spiritual Forum.